Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. Merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? You can shoot me with your words, you can cut me with your lies, you can kill me with your hatefulness, but just like life, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise.
Now the record companies is like stifling the brother. They trying to make it to whereas rap music is gonna be just propaganda. They telling you what to say. They telling you everything we got now. All that stuff we were saying before was cool because they didn't think nobody was listening. But now they know they listening. They stifling all that. You can't say what you want. You can't do what you want. You can't wear what you want. It's like, you know what I'm saying? They straight censoring us. So it's about to be about some street stuff. It's about to be about us. Meaning us that got black skin taking over our own destiny, because it's ours, and we can have it. If you ain't seen that from the riots, you ain't seen nothing. That was an uprising. That was us just letting these folks know. Any given time, we'll bring them on something extremely proper. Big time. That's what we're trying to feel.
The problem of the black people in America is inseparable from the problem of oppressed people all over the world. And until the leaders of black America realize that our problem is inseparable from the entire international problem, we will be considered a minority, will be considered an underdog, and will be begging for the things that we should have had when we were born.
In today's society of America, many people are undergoing a benevolent process of changes in their life by decontaminating the poisonous traditional forms of indoctrination and overcoming the complexity of its burdensome physical and psychological, nearly permanent effects, by unlearning or rather deprogramming the information taught throughout compulsory educational institutions of yesterday and today. Whereas a fact is literally based on the one-directional formatted belief of an individual's opinion, which may seem harmless to those who are satisfied with taking someone else's word for it, versus finding it out on their own through the process of diligent researching. By undergoing this process, an individual will soon discover that there is an actual difference between a fact and truth, and that most popular things that we were all taught in these compulsory educational institutions or by word of mouth that are considered to be a fact were never true. And with this new light form of discovery comes a positive change. And with this positive change comes an energetic realization of the actual truth, which adamantly reveals these multiple malicious hidden agendas surrounding what we call history, various forms of science, and even down to the English language, just to name a few. And speaking of just that, it is essential to recognize and master the understanding of the English language, because it can hold a person mentally captive merely by the misunderstanding of a word's definition, especially when it pertains to law, education, or even social science. There is a big reason why, when a person recalls or names each letter of a word, that gesture or process is called spelling. The underlining word in this sense would obviously be spell, which could carry a variety of different essential meanings within itself. The majority of people would recall the most popular definition of spell, which pertains to writing or naming the letters of a word correctly, while on the other hand, the not so popular or rather uncommonly used definition of spell pertains to words that has magical powers, to say the least, but usually in a negative sense, because what you do is mentally and physically out of your control. What I mean by that is your thoughts and actions, or rather your reality, is completely dictated and heavily influenced by the spell of the words you speak. Literally. This is why you would hear the saying, be careful what you wish for, because a person can play that same spelling trick of the English language amongst themselves inadvertently. We find this type of trick, uncommonly known as the Mandela effect, in the thinking that a particular word means one thing, and yet truthfully it would dangerously mean another, regardless of a person's opinion. The word minority is a very good example of that, and it also details why the so-called African Americans are labeled as the minority group here in America. For example, the Webster's Dictionary defines the word minority as a, quote, group that is the smaller part of a larger group, in which this definition could serve as the means as to why most political figures, news reporters, or even bigoted individuals, etc., for labeling the so-called African Americans as the minority group. In this case, the word minority relates to a particular population size, marking the so-called African Americans, or rather the indigenous American Indians in this sense, as being the least amount of people who makes up the United States population. And the spell, or rather the trick of this side of the minority definition, is that the so-called Black Americans would just simply take someone's word for it and let it slide without any backlash. See, no one challenges the reported numbers of the US population by race. In fact, they would say things like, I mean, why waste time doing that anyway? They can't be off by a significant amount, right? I mean, come on. They are the government, for Christ's sake. Why would they have a reason to lie about something so inadequate? My answer to that would be, that's just like deeming the statement, men lie, women lie, but numbers don't lie, as a fact. Whereas the information behind the creation of those numbers literally derived from men or women. So if they lie, then so can numbers, right? Think about it. Now, if Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, implemented birth control pills in the United States during her eugenics-formatted population program called the Negro Project of 1939, in order to alter the population growth of only the so-called African Americans, then would that indicate to you that the so-called African Americans are the minority population of race in America, or not? Now let's take things a step further and look closer into the word minority. At a time where the Homestead Acts of 1862, 1866, and 1909 were implemented into what was known as, quote, the laws of the lands, as a means to forcefully, fraudulently allot lands of America, or Turtle Island, originally owned and occupied by our indigenous ancestors, to those newly incoming pale-faced foreigners immigrating from parts of North, West, and especially South Africa, like Europe for example, to America by the millions according to the 1790 US Census and beyond. Now, before I go any further, you can recall that I have stated numerous times throughout my previous documentaries that everything was told to us in reverse, and where Europe is actually located is not excluded as an example of my statement. What I mean by that is, Europe was purposely predicted, or rather placed at the top of all other countries, displayed in Mercator world maps and other maps shortly thereafter, for a very particular reason. And that reason is due to
the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power. In our society we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
So, no, Europe is not where you think it is. In fact,
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I go into more informative detail about that in my documentary called The Untold Truth, about why history was told to you in reverse. That is a documentary that I highly recommend all people to watch in order to understand what I'm about to state next. Now let's go back in time a little to the years of 1913 and 1936, at a time when land acts were adopted into law in South Africa. Now what's very important to note here is that these laws are very identical to the Homestead Acts in America that I mentioned earlier. They were called the Native Land Act of 1913 and the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, in which these particular land acts allowed for the territorial segregation of the Native Africans and made it illegal for them to work with the white Afrikaners as sharecroppers, meaning they could no longer share their lands, crops, and other resources with the white Afrikaners, who spoke a Dutch-created foreign language called Afrikaans, in which they paid a fee in order to continue to be tenants of the native Africans' lands. Through the passing of these land acts, along with several others shortly thereafter, it allowed for more than 80% of these already inhabited lands to be cleared of native Africans and sold at a very cheap rate to white Afrikaners only. During this time period, the traditional society of South Africa had been infiltrated by way of industrialized governmental policies and many other operational forms of white supremacy. Upon the creation of these land acts, the birth of apartheid arose simultaneously. Side note, apartheid means separateness, or rather a state of being pulled apart. This is when the money-hungry white Afrikaners wanted to divide the native South Africans in order to decrease, or rather quell, their economic and political powers. With these laws now in place, the all-white Afrikaner National Party was established in 1948, which they created an all-white government that helped to rapidly enforce all pre-existing and future regulations and policies of racial segregation, to include the previously written, quote, laws of the Land Acts that I mentioned earlier. Did you catch that? Listen closely. Once the non-white South Africans, or the native Africans, were forced off of their own lands and removed out of their own homes and placed on reserves, similar to today's Indian reservations or plantations, or what we know now as the public housing areas found in North America's ghettos, for example, the non-white South Africans were also forced to work industrialized jobs in order to single-handedly build up South Africa into a capitalist society. What's very noteworthy here is that the Population Registration Act of 1950 was implemented into law, very identical to an American law enacted in 1972 called the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which allowed for a person to self-identify themselves in order to ensure that they were not being discriminated against because of their race, nationality, or disability, etc. The PRA, or rather the Population Registration Act of 1950, was used to identify and classify all South Africans by categories. These categories were Bantu for the native South Africans, Colored for the mixed South Africans, and the Afrikaners were classified as white, while a fourth category was added for the East Indians and Pakistanis, labeling them as Asian. This method of fraudulent misclassification and land robbery by way of these land acts and laws only assisted and ensured that the white Afrikaners received the most fertile lands available in their region through government parental rights or ownership of set majorities by way of treaty rights or constitutions and other trickery, which in turn allowed for the sale of the already owned and occupied lands of the native South Africans to be handed over and or sold to their white oppressors. Also, these Afrikaners captured the mindsets of the native South Africans by the creation and cultivation of a false ideology that forcefully implemented laws through religious societies, also known today as the viral establishment of the institution of the church, which lawfully granted the husband or the eldest man of a family as the head of the household by law systematically. This methodology segued into the creation of laws that recognized ownership through the male of the household only. Furthermore, by then removing the head or the male from within the home by way of war, jail, or death, the government was able to acquire the lawful rights to the quote, abandoned lands under the color of law. Does any of this sound familiar yet? Allow me to repeat this again. The great majority of the native Africans were living on their lands and decided to share some of it to farm with newly incoming white Afrikaners of Dutch descent, which in turn made them sharecroppers. However, these land acts removed these natives to reserves and forced them into industrial servant laboring positions for the white Afrikaners, or rather known today as slavery. Unfortunately, this form of deceptive methodology had been implemented along with several other occurrences in multiple locations since the start of this so-called Mandela effect, and it is the true aftermath or outcome of being a minority. Now you can see how a lot of the similarities to what we now face here in America is not a coincidence, being that we are the direct descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of this land now called America, and how our historical timeline directly correlates to this similar timeline that I'm about to go over, which was planned and carried out by the same white Afrikaners who immigrated by the millions to the Americas during the years of the Homestead Acts, when subsequently laws were created to give them our farms.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm, with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms, in order that they could mechanize their farms, in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, we are coming to get our check.
Now, let's quickly go over the timeline of these laws and acts that you probably never heard of before it somehow disappears from the internet and other primary sources. These acts include the Black Land Act of 1913, formerly known as the Native Land Act of 1913, the Development Trust and Land Act of 1936, formerly known as the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, the Unbeneficial Occupation of Farms Act of 1937, the Colored Persons Settlement Act of 1946, the Asiatic Land Act of 1946, the Black Affairs Act of 1959, formerly known as the Native Affairs Act of 1959, the Group Areas Act of 1966, and then finally the Black Communities Development Act of 1984, in which many of these fraudulent acts were repealed and removed on June 30th, 1991, with the abolition of the Racially Based Land Measures Act. Now, how did the native South Africans put a stop to slavery, you ask? Well, I'll explain. The Native Land Act of 1913 and the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936 were only the start to a much larger plan to be carried out, but it became increasingly difficult after the South African Apartheid, in which Native Africans decided that they were no longer going to work for their white Afrikaner oppressors at all. After the Native Africans decided to no longer work, this delivered a winning blow to their oppressors, which set into motion these acts to be removed on June 30th, 1991. And it was then that other motions were set in place here in North America, which in turn reveals the true Mandela effect. So now, what is the real definition of the term minority? Not to be confused any longer with the commonly known definition referring to a group of people in relation to race that has a smaller population than another group of people. No, the truth is that the definition of minority is a group of people that are being dominated and controlled by another group of people. The mistakes that were made in South Africa only highlights what I stated in my previous documentaries as to why so-called African Americans are a threat to American society. And it is also the true reason why billions are spent to keep us separated here as a people. Because if a group of particular people can no longer continue to dominate and control us physically, spiritually, and mentally, systematically, as their minority here in America, then what will be the outcome of a king and a queen checking and trapping the opposing king in a corner? I'm just here to make you think.
Well, now to a fascinating and significant story the media have all but ignored. South Africa is a diverse country, but the South African government would like to make it much less diverse. An embattled minority of farmers, mostly Afrikaans-speaking, is being targeted in a wave of barbaric and horrifying murders. But instead of protecting them, the government just passed a law allowing it to seize their farms without any compensation based purely on their ethnicity and distribute those farms to more favored groups. Thousands have already migrated out of the country, but they've struggled to attract any sympathy abroad for some reason. Ernst Roets is deputy CEO of AfriForum. It's a South Africa civil rights group. He was just in the United States to meet with a number of government officials. He also took a moment to talk to us. Here's part of what he said. Ernst Roets joins us now. Mr. Roets, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.
So you describe in this book a disorganized but in some sense intentional campaign to crush a racial minority within your country, and the government seems on board with it. Is that an overstatement?
Well, what the book is about is it's about government complicity in the scourge of farm attacks and farm murders that we've seen in South Africa. So we know in the last 2 decades there's been, according to government statistics, which we believe, we have reason to say that it's maybe downplayed a little, there's been about 2 farm attacks every day and 2 farm murders every week in South Africa. And in the book I highlight actually 10 different reasons why we believe the South African government is complicit. And it stretches from reasons including the fact that as these attacks have worsened, for example in 2007 there was a 25% increase in these attacks, and then the South African government responded saying we're not going to release any more statistics about this. Then also, which is very concerning, is the hate speech in South Africa. So we have, that's the title of the book as well, Kill the Boer, which is a very popular song, which is still being sung in South Africa. It was sung just the other day. So it's sung at political rallies, and of course Boer referring to a particular cultural group in South Africa. Right. We have songs like Shoot the Boer, which is a different song. So there are a variety of ways in which we
But I thought that hate speech was now a crime punishable by prison time in South Africa. Are any of the people who say this arrested?
Well, there's a bill on the table to have hate speech declared a crime punishable by prison time. But if you look at the motivation around this, it's very clear that I think those in government who are pushing this don't regard this as hate speech. As a matter of fact, they've been arguing that it's not hate speech in courts. So they would argue that they have a right to sing about killing farmers, and then they would say it's an expression of freedom of speech.
So now the government has announced that it plans to pursue a policy of taking land away from people on the basis of their skin color. Do you think they'll do that?
Well, that's what was adopted in our parliament in February. A motion was adopted that the property rights clause in the South African constitution has to be changed to allow for expropriation of private property without compensation. So the state president, Cyril Ramaphosa, said that this would turn South Africa into the ultimate paradise and the Garden of Eden. And Deputy President David Mabuza even went further, saying that, basically threatening white farmers that if they do not voluntarily hand over their land to black people, then there would be a violent takeover. So the situation is very dire in South Africa. But the good news is that there's still a process that has to be followed, and that's why we are in the United States.
What I find so striking is the response from everyone else around the world is almost never covered in the American media. There's a sense that the people being murdered deserve it because of what their ancestors did. And the international community is similarly silent. Have you met with any government officials here in Washington about what's happening in your country?
Well, that's why we are here. We are about to meet with some government officials, and it's very unfortunate, the situation that you've just mentioned. So there's, especially in South Africa, there's a hierarchy of recognition. So some people, when they are the victims, it's all over the news and you hear about it frequently, and other people, as especially, I think, especially farmers in South Africa, white farmers in particular, when they would be tortured to death and it would receive very little news coverage, and that's unfortunately the situation abroad as well, which is why we are very grateful to be having this.
So a government official in Australia said publicly, maybe we ought to allow asylum to people being persecuted for their skin color in your country. And he was basically laughed at and then attacked by your government for saying that.
Yes, he was attacked, and they then said that he shouldn't say that because AfriForum was providing them with false information, while the information that we are quoting is government statistics. So that is the situation. Whoever speaks out against this, just for being in the United States, we've been accused of treason. We've had people threatening us, saying they'll wait for us at the airport when we come back and they'll attack us and so forth. We had the state president today in Parliament calling on us to go back to South Africa. So whenever you speak out against this, there's a very serious backlash.
This is not what Nelson Mandela wanted.
No, it's the exact opposite than what he wanted. He publicly spoke about a free country in which people were not judged by the color of their skin, and he even wanted farmer tax to be a priority crime. He said that when he was president, and when his presidency was over, they deprioritized it.
So you just watched something like this happen in a neighboring country, Zimbabwe, which went from being one of the richest in Africa to the poorest in the world because of farm attacks and because of the theft of private property. Is the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, aware of that lesson?
Yeah. Well, they are, but you know that saying, real communism has never been tried. That's what they keep saying. So it failed in Zimbabwe, it failed in Cuba, it failed in Venezuela, it failed in Russia, it failed in China, in all of those countries. And they're basically saying that we're going to try the same thing, but this time it's going to work.
So last question. It's considered basically immoral in the United States to talk to you or to hear stories like this for reasons that nobody ever bothers really to explain, but it's just understood. If you could speak to our media, or the people who are dismissing your claims as false, what would you say?
Well, I think there are three things. Firstly, everything we say is fact-based. It's based on research. But in terms of what we hope to achieve and what people can do, people who want to invest in South Africa, we want them to call on the South African government to say, listen, you are calling on us to invest in your country, but you want to expropriate those investments. Number two, we are speaking with the US government and asking them to put pressure on the South African government, which could be done in a variety of ways. And number three, members of the public and members of the media, the best thing that you can do to help us is to talk about this, to talk about it on public platforms, and in that way to continue to put pressure on the South African government not to continue with this policy.
Just to tell the truth. I agree. Mr. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being